All right, I think it's about time to get this show started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ian Curtis. I'm the chair of the programs committee at PCFR that puts together all these great programs that we get to enjoy today, for example. And for my full-time job, I'm the assistant dean of Asia at the WB Business at ASU. So first of all, thank you to everyone who came today, and to our speakers, of course. As someone who spent a number of years in East Asia, based out of Beijing, studying the region, this is a very timely and powerful topic with potentially quite impressive ramifications for Southeast Asia, and a case study for U.S. engagement in the region and how to manage some of these more complex governments in transition and so forth. So I'm very excited to hear the details in the next hour. The Phoenix Committee on Foreign Relations is our premier foreign relations organization here in Arizona, dedicated to growing Arizona's global prominence by providing forums such as this that explore critical foreign policy issues and build enduring international connections. So please save your dates for some of our upcoming programs. Tomorrow actually is our first in-person dinner for almost 2 years because of a few things that have happened between now and then. We have a sold-out dinner with the ambassador of Mexico to the United States, Esteban Moctezuma, at the Monte Lucia, in partnership with the Mexican consulate here in Phoenix. And of course, this time it couldn't be any more relevant with the announcement of the borders reopening to vaccinated travelers just yesterday or today. So we're excited also to have our own book club and our reading group. And we will be reading Challenging China by Sam Kaplan, who will be our speaker in November as well. So for those who are interested in engaging in that, please purchase your copy and read with all of us, who will be meeting on October 29th to discuss the book. Sam will then be joining us on November 3rd for a virtual discussion on China and the book. So a great opportunity to dive in deep and then get the further details from the author himself shortly thereafterwards. And then on November 4th, we'll be hosting the ambassador of Sweden to the US, Karen Olofsdotter, in person at the law school for a talk and a reception starting at 4 p.m. So please visit our website, pcfraz.org, and sign up for any future programs. And of course, become a member while you're there. We would love to have you join us. We're planning some other great events for our members, specifically in the fall and winter, including the annual Desert Botanical Gardens. So before we get started, we have to send our gratitude to all of our sponsors for making all of this work possible. First off, our title sponsor, Freeport McMoran, our media sponsor, KJZZ, our platinum sponsors, ASU Sandra Day O'Connor Law School, the McCain Institute, Snell and Wilmer, W.R. Schultz Investments, and the Thunderbird School of Global Management. Our gold sponsors, Salt River Project, APS, and South 32. Our silver sponsors, Spencer Fain, Wallace Plesh and Dreyer, Chicanos por la Causa, and Resolution Copper. And I would also like to thank our international visionary donor, Ellen Schultz, and lifetime benefactors who have generously given gifts to allow PCFR to fulfill our mission here in the Valley. Keith Galbert, Charles Irian, Karen Meyer, J.P. Millen, Shoshana Transer, and Melissa Sanderson. Finally, I'd like to thank Chan Nguyen from the Center of Asian Research at ASU for sharing this program with so many of our students here in the Valley who are also in the audience. So some quick housekeeping things for the program. Please, please, please keep your audio on mute. And we'll have the opportunity to ask our guest speakers questions following the official part of the program. Some of the Q&A will open for afterwards. This program is recorded and will be available to our members on our website afterwards. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers and moderator. Joining us is Ambassador Scart Marcial, who served as ambassador to Myanmar from 2016 to 2020. He's a visiting scholar and practitioner fellow on Southeast Asia at Stanford University's Walter Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. Welcome, Ambassador. We also have Lynn Salinger, a development economist and principal associate with Nathan Associates, an economic advisory service firm based in Arlington, Virginia. Since 2015, Linda supported 2 economic growth programs for USAID in Myanmar. She's also, a fun fact, the daughter of one of our longtime members, Warren Salinger, who is in the audience today as well. Finally, it is my pleasure to turn it over to our moderator, Professor Charles Ripley from the School of Politics and Global Studies at ASU. He received his doctorate at ASU in 2013. And fun fact, he took many of the same classes as our own executive director in graduate school. So with that, I will hand it over to Charles to take it away.
Hey, thanks a lot, Ian. I really appreciate that introduction and everyone who has showed up. And you are going to learn tons from these 2 people just in about a 10-minute quick Zoom we did previously. I learned so much, and this is such an important subject, but that's the question, the first question to open this up. First of all, tell us a little about Myanmar. As I tell my students, very few people know about Myanmar because it's such a closed society, and you 2 have a wealth of knowledge. And 2, so what? Why is this important, not only from a regional standpoint, but also from a more globally oriented standpoint, and particularly for the United States?
Thanks, Charles, and thanks, Ian. Questions? Thanks, and thanks to the council for inviting me to join your program. A little bit about also known as Burma, for many years known as Burma. It's changed its name officially in 1989, but the United States still calls it officially Burma, which causes some confusion. Basically, Burma, Myanmar, sits on the Indian Ocean between China and India. So it's straddled by the 2 biggest countries in the world. It's part of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, 10 nations that make up the region. It's got about 55 million people, maybe 80% of whom are Buddhist, and the majority of whom are ethnic Bama. And the geography and ethnicity part is really important. It tells the whole story, really, of this country. The center, the heartland, if you will, of the country, which is lowland, is predominantly populated by the ethnic Bama Buddhist community. But all around the borders of the country, which tends to be more mountainous, hilly, you have a wide range of ethnic minority groups. Some are Christian, many are Christian, some are Buddhist. And the country's been called an incomplete nation because with all these disparate groups, they've never really unified it behind the idea of what does it mean to be from Burma or Myanmar. And the ethnic minority groups in the border areas have long felt disenfranchised and discriminated against, and have sought either independence or a fair amount of autonomy. And this desire, this feeling that they're not treated equally, has led to conflict really since the 1940s. It's actually the world's longest running civil war. The military, which took over power in 1962 in a coup, most dominated by the Bama, sought basically to forcibly, unify the country, sort of force everybody to assimilate. It's been a disaster. They ran the country for 50 years and really ran it into the ground with conflict, lots of human rights violations, but they also ruined the economy, the education system, the healthcare system. I mean, if you want an example of a really bad government, look at the military government from 1962 to 2010, 11. So it is this incomplete nation, and one that's been suffering from really bad rule for most of its history. Why does it matter? And we'll get into the coup, but why does it matter? First, it's 55 million people who fundamentally want the same things that we want: freedom, democracy, some opportunities. And they often look to the United States as, as someone who they hope will support their desire. There's people who are making tremendous sacrifices to try to get the sort of freedoms that we've enjoyed and the opportunities that we've enjoyed. Second, as I mentioned, it lies between India and China. For China, China wants access through Myanmar to the Indian Ocean. And they have got various projects in the works that would give them direct access through Myanmar into the Indian Ocean. What the United States wants is two things. We want the people to be able to enjoy those freedoms and democracy and opportunities. And we want them to have the freedom to choose to have good relations with China, but not be dominated by China or any of its other big neighbors. A couple of other important facts. Myanmar is the world's largest producer of methamphetamines, which get exported all over the region and cause huge problems throughout the region. And this is really caused by all these ungoverned, lawless areas where there's been conflict. Has been a great place for organized crime to set up operation. It also actually produces a lot of rare earths up in the northeast country, so it's important in supply chain terms. But I would say fundamentally what's most important is this is a country of people who really, really are fighting for some freedom and democracy and looking to the United States for support. Last point is because it's a member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is 650 million people, and collectively the world's 5th largest economy. Right now, the disaster that is Myanmar after the coup is causing havoc within ASEAN. It's really divided this organization, which is an important partner for the United States and for many other countries in the world. And right now, the outlook is for more violence and instability and more troubles for ASEAN and for the whole region. I'll stop there.
Lynn, did you want to chime in on that, please?
Sure, with the first disclaimer that my observations today are my own and don't reflect either those of my employer or the US government with which we work. But let me give you a sense of the economic overlay to understand or contextualize a bit what Ambassador Marcial has just told us. It's, as he has underlined, it's important to know that Myanmar really suffered 5 decades of near isolation from the time of the 1962 coup that he mentioned and its socialist pivot up through 2011, when the last military leader of the country actually decided to liberalize the country, both politically and economically. But the last 10 years have been a period of incredible economic growth and transformation, moving the country from the economy from one that was largely import substitution, inwardly focused, to one that was much more export oriented, but also increasingly diversifying from its base on agriculture and natural resource extraction to include more manufacturing as part of global supply chains. But how does an average family, if there is such a thing in Myanmar, earn a living? As of the last census in 2015, 70%, it's a pretty high share of the population, was considered rural, which meant that their livelihoods depended on agriculture and other rural activities. But another 10% of Myanmar people actually live and work abroad. Why is that? Because the country is actually that poor and the livelihood opportunities that people face are that limited. And so Myanmar men and women have left the country for years, seeking work in neighboring countries such as Thailand and Malaysia and beyond. And the remittances that those people send back to their families is an important source of family income. While a family in the rural countryside may be producing rice or vegetables or other crops, they're also sending a son to Bangkok for a construction job or a daughter to Yangon to work in a garment factory. All of that changed, however, in early 2020 when, because of COVID, borders closed and thus families lost an important source of their income basis. So that's at the household level. Just reiterating what Scott said about the national economy, an important source of revenue are the royalties and dividends generated by the export of oil and gas, timber, jade, gemstones, and other minerals significant to the country. And I guess I would also say that over the last 10 years, a number of international companies have taken an interest in the Myanmar market, with private banks, insurance companies, distribution firms, and manufacturing companies setting up shop in Myanmar, but also global sourcing happening as buyers came to Myanmar factories for garments, travel bags, footwear, and other labor-intensive goods. And then February 1 happened, and I'll just launch into my sense of what the economic impacts of the coup have been. Probably one of the most noticeable impacts is that, well, for starters, foreign aid ceased. Overseas bank accounts of the government have been frozen. But more importantly, people within the country really began to oppose the takeover by the military, to the point where payments of taxes and utility bills are now being boycotted by many within the country. The government is having a very hard time selling treasury bills, selling timber, selling jade and gemstones. So the main source of legitimate revenue for the country now is from the sale of exporting gas, 80% of which is exported to Thailand and to China. We've also had the withdrawal or the announcement of intention of withdrawal by a number of international companies. Telenor, a Norwegian telecommunications firm, has announced that it intends to sell its license to the Lebanese M1 Group, while Metro, a German wholesale distribution company, and very recently the British American Tobacco Company have both announced their intention to leave Myanmar as of the end of this month. Why? Because the reputational risk to them of staying within the country is just too high, or they're not able to attract the international capital needed for their projects. I guess I would say the most significant impact of the coup to date has been in the financial sector and in the foreign exchange market. Immediately following the coup, many in the banking sector joined what is known as the CDM, the civil disobedience movement, leading banks to near collapse. ATMs were not stocked, and access to banking counters was restricted. It was very difficult for people to get cash in the country. And then 2 weeks ago, we saw what amounted to a 50% collapse in the value of the domestic currency, the Burmese kyat. It's restabilized a little bit in the last 2 weeks, but that reflects an increased demand on the part of people within the country to convert their savings to a hard currency, so to speak, and so into US dollars and other currencies, as well as into gold. I will perhaps stop there and we can get into other economic dimensions as the conversation goes on.
That was amazing. I learned so much from that. And you two just now, I didn't know remittances was such a huge part of the economy, which is very important to understand, whether remittances now with the coup have been kind of curtailed because they don't want to send it back to Myanmar. But this, really produces an important question. Why would they open up politically, economically, and allow a semblance of democracy to happen, and then literally just say, okay, we're going to go back? What is in the interest of the military? Were they losing something? Were they losing power? Did they fear something? I mean, you two are going to help me with that. And a second question, and I don't mean to bombard you with questions because now I have a lot of questions, is that the way Scott describes it is kind of like the former Yugoslavia, where you have all these different groups wanting autonomy. Is there a possibility, even if it's far away, of Myanmar to kind of break up? And states do that. Obviously, the most notable case, India, East Pakistan, that became Bangladesh, and then India, and then obviously the former Yugoslavia. So I'll let you two take care of those two questions.
All right. On the first question, and I didn't get into the coup yet, but I think the general belief is that the military, after ruling for 50 years, opened up starting in 2011 for a couple of reasons. One, after some international travel, some of the leadership just realized how far behind they were. Two, they were concerned, a very nationalistic group, they were concerned about becoming too dependent on China because they were a pariah state. China was one of the few countries that would work with them, and they were becoming too dependent on China. And I think they believed that they could open up and reform and control the process. So they thought they could open up and allow significant reforms without losing fundamental political power. They miscalculated. They did open up, make significant reforms, which surprised almost everybody, but then lost in the national elections in 2015 to Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi and her longtime opposition party, the National League for Democracy. They tolerated that uncomfortably because I think they had calculated that the cost of stepping back in were too high. But then in 2020, when there were other additional elections or second elections, where the NLD led by Aung San Suu Kyi won by an even larger margin. And the military, I think, was really concerned that in a second term, this government would chip away that much more, not only at their political power, but at their economic power. Plus, the leader of the military, General Min Aung Hlaing, personally very ambitious, very corrupt. He was concerned. He wanted a position in senior position in government that would allow him to protect himself legally as well as financially. So I think that's why they staged the coup. I think it was a terrible miscalculation, but this is a military that never has been able to read its own country because they're kind of hermetically sealed as an institution from the rest of the country. And they didn't think there was going to be this much opposition, this much resistance. And what's happened is that the public as a whole has basically formed a national resistance. To me, the closest comparison would be a national resistance to a foreign occupying force, in the sense that the military has no public support, no credibility, no legitimacy in the country. It's really overwhelming how much the population as a whole, while they may disagree on a lot of other things, wants the military out. And so the military, I think, has not only hurt the country terribly, but it's done major damage to itself as an institution. Lynn, you want to add to that?
I would just note that in terms of the geographic spread of the conflict, you were asking about, are there possible splinterings that might happen off of the total of Burma or of Myanmar? What's remarkable is, as Scott was describing earlier, conflict used to be concentrated, and we usually show a map of where conflict is based around the edges of the country, right, in the borderlands.
I have another meeting.
There we go. So you can see the map of Myanmar, and you can also see an older map of where conflict was concentrated, largely in the north and along the eastern border. But what's remarkable,
I don't like the women's organization.
What's remarkable about what's happening now is that conflict is actually becoming more generalized. And what we've seen over the last several months is that you now have conflict incidents happening even in the center of the country, where the Bamar population predominates. And so while perhaps in earlier times, one might have thought about one region or another wanting to break away, now I would say that conflict has become far more generalized.
Yeah, if I could just add, Charles, on the splintering issue, it's certainly a possibility. I think before the coup, there was general agreement among the various players in the country that the solution for the country was a form of federalism. So the country would stay unified, but with a certain amount of authority and responsibility devolved to the different regions and states in the country. There was disagreement about the details, how to actually go about that. So I think the hope for the country is some form of federalism. I think that's really the only way to see it working. But if that doesn't happen, if the military does stay in power, there's certainly a risk of areas splintering off. You already have a few enclaves, particularly right up near the Chinese border, where armed groups basically run semi-independent entities. The trouble for them is that, particularly if they're up near the Chinese border, if they declare independence, almost inevitably they are going to become immediately fully dependent on China. That's not a huge concern for some, but it's a big concern for others.
But if they're so unpopular, is there any, let's just say, unified movement to overthrow the military? I mean, in my area, you see guerrilla groups all the time, whether it's, Castro overthrowing Batista or the Sandinistas overthrowing Somoza, etc. Is there any unified opposition that could actually take out the military?
As with everything in Myanmar, it's very complicated. Before the coup, the armed opposition, as Lynn mentioned, was largely limited to the ethnic minority areas where there were about 24 different ethnic armed groups, some pretty small, some pretty significant. After the coup, the ethnic Bamar, who had not been involved really in any kind of resistance movement, began with massive peaceful protests and the civil disobedience movement that Lynn mentioned. In other words, peaceful efforts to put pressure on the military. The military went in and just started massacring people, torturing people to death. It was just horrific. So that has driven a number of people, ethnic Bamar as well as ethnic minorities, to move toward armed resistance. There is a national unity government formed out of remnants of the elected parliament, basically those who weren't arrested by the military and some others. And they have had some efforts to reach out to the ethnic armed groups to try to coalesce and form one big movement. But there's decades of mistrust between the ethnic Bama and the ethnic minorities that it's really not easy to overcome. So there is a nascent unified movement, but the national unity government, because it's made up of people in hiding or along the borders or even in foreign countries, it's very hard for them to organize that way. So it's somewhat chaotic situation, I would say. So there's unity in terms of mentality of trying to get rid of military rule, but not really a unified force or a unified movement per se in a really organized way.
I would just add that there is a sense among younger generations in Myanmar that the old ways just won't work anymore, and that in alliance with the NUG, the National Unity Government, one needs to be thinking not only of a federalist structure for Myanmar in the future, but one that embraces all ethnic backgrounds. And so there was great frustration, certainly amongst my colleagues in Myanmar, in recent times when Aung San Suu Kyi went to the International Court of Justice and basically defended the actions of the government against the Rohingya people. I think younger generations are very much in favor of a much more unified and ethnically diverse approach to planning the country's future.
Now, obviously, we can't get into conflict resolution yet because I don't know if there can be, but how are the neighboring states? India, obviously, Bangladesh is absorbing a huge amount of refugees, the role of China, etc., and even a possible negotiation on the part of ASEAN. Is there any throughout this? I mean, obviously, I would use the word genocide against the Rohingya, as well as other groups. And I know there's a lot of dislike between all the different groups. It's not just against the Rohingya. There's a lot of other ethnic and religious groups there. But is there any shining light in this? Can any regional or the United Nations or something play a role to roll back the military coup and kind of bring stability and prosperity to this country?
Yeah, it's a huge question and really difficult to answer. The short answer is there hasn't been any significant progress, despite some efforts by any number of groups, the UN, ASEAN, and others. The fundamental problem, and the Rohingya issue is huge. It's basically in a country with lots of different groups that feel like they're not treated equally and so on, and sometimes face prejudice. The Rohingya, there's even an argument about whether they exist as a group. It's really complicated and hard to fathom from a Western perspective, but they certainly bore the brunt and faced the most institutionalized discrimination. But in terms of dealing with the conflict now, ASEAN has sought to mediate. They agreed at an April summit on 5 common points under which the military was supposed to end violence and begin a dialogue with the opposition. The military basically just ignored that. ASEAN has a special envoy who's supposed to visit soon. I think expectations for ASEAN special envoy are extremely low, largely because the military has shown no interest in any kinds of compromise or concession. They don't have a history of compromise concession. And the resistance, for lack of a better term, also is at this point not particularly enthused about dialogue. They want to just get rid of the military as at least as a political force. So the environment is not right. There's people, diplomats, people like me tend to say, well, let's have dialogue. This should be resolved through dialogue. Yeah, in theory. But at this point, there's just the environment is not ripe for that at all. And my view is that you will need dialogue at some point, but first the military needs to feel so pressured that it realizes that there's no hope of winning. Then maybe in order to save the institution, you might find military officers willing to make major concessions. And at that point, possibly you could have an ASEAN-led mediation effort or something. But at this point, sadly, it's hard to see it.
But when you look at ASEAN, where do those countries stand? I mean, do they gain anything? My argument, although I obviously don't know as much as you two, is that most of the surrounding countries would be a little tired of just, particularly because of the COVID, the economy's not doing too well, of just absorbing so many refugees. Is there a lot of xenophobia developing in these countries? Is there any protection for these refugees?
There is some support for refugees, but I think the fundamental problem in ASEAN is you've got a handful of ASEAN countries, particularly Indonesia, to a certain extent Malaysia and Singapore, have been quite outspoken and critical of the coup and basically issued warnings to the military that if they persist in what they're doing and don't seek some kind of compromise and dialogue, their status within ASEAN, their ability to participate in ASEAN things could be in jeopardy. But there are other ASEAN countries who say, hey, ASEAN has always been about non-interference in each other's internal affairs. And in some cases, they're authoritarian as well. And so they're not a little bit worried about setting a precedent of ASEAN getting involved. So ASEAN's really split on this, which is bad for the organization, and it's making it look exceptionally weak. And so I think there's a certain amount of let's just hope this gets better, which is not going to get better. And so there's a pretty active debate within ASEAN about what to do, but at this point, no clear way forward.
Scott, is it fair to say that the country bearing the brunt, such as it is, of refugee influx is Thailand, right next door, and that the Thai leadership and the Myanmar leadership are actually pretty tight in terms of their shared worldview?
Yeah, I mean, the Thai government led by former General Prayut, who himself staged a coup in 2014, is seen to be pretty close to the Myanmar military, and so far has chosen not to be very critical. But the Thai are also concerned about the instability across the border, the refugees, the narcotics, etc. And although we've certainly been critical of the Thai coup, it's the level of violence and suppression and human rights violations from that military don't compare to what the Myanmar military has done. So yeah, Thailand's in a difficult situation for sure, and I think is struggling to they can't be happy with the current situation, but probably don't see an easy way out either.
Right. That's the question. Is there a breaking point for these countries? Because I know Thailand, from students who actually have been in Myanmar through Thailand, has had a pretty, I don't want to say open borders or anything like that, but the people from Thailand will go to Myanmar. People from Myanmar will go to Thailand to buy different goods and services and things like that. And that's the question: is there a breaking point for these countries that it becomes so unstable that they're forced to act? Because as Scott stressed quite astutely, and Lynn as well, is that it's getting so bad they might try to ignore it, but it just keeps on, bubbling up, and there is a boiling point to where there's a breaking point for these countries. And this is an amazing conversation. I want to thank everyone out there. And there is, Lynn, and I know, not to get into the chat yet, but someone did, I noticed, send a very inquisitive question about the currency and the likelihood of a total economic collapse. I mean, if it is as bad as you two are communicating it, where do we see Myanmar if we just let this keep on developing like it is, or underdeveloping? Where do we see it in 1 or 2 years economically? It seems like the country, particularly with its currency, pulling out of foreign investors, that becomes a slippery slope. More pull out, remittances decrease, etc. Where do we see this country, economically speaking, in a couple years?
Simple answer is who knows. But let's focus on perhaps the nearer term. One thing I didn't mention is that in many other parts of the world, as vaccination rates have picked up and as COVID, at least the economic impacts of COVID have started to wane in industrial countries, demand for international commodities has picked up again. Which means that international commodity prices have picked up again. You all may have noticed, as have I, that when you fill up your gas tank, gas costs a lot more than it did a year ago. Well, that same effect, plus the depreciation of the kyat, is making price pressure within the borders of Myanmar extremely tight. So what we're seeing, what I see is not the potential for a tipping point being reached vis-a-vis the region, but rather a tipping point reached within Myanmar. So you have a doubling of fuel prices, rising costs of all imports, whether that's pharmaceutical products or fertilizers needed to produce food, or even the guns and other military equipment that the military needs to bring in order to continue its offense. All of those costs are going up, which means in turn that people's purchasing power is diminishing rapidly, including of soldiers on fixed salaries. And so I guess I would suggest that while people may be just scraping by for now, the tipping point that I see is that if the harvest is bad at the end of this year, if the prices of food and fuel continue to rise, if the kyat continues to depreciate, it's anyone's guess what might push the military to at least change course, if not, see even more intense reactions.
Scott, anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Lynn's described the economic situation well. I think the World Bank's latest forecast is for an 18% drop in economic output this year, which is, extraordinarily bad. And I think it's important also, the human cost here is incredible. There's certainly horrific violence perpetrated by the military, torturing, arresting and torturing little kids. I mean, it's just, are shelling villages, etc. But more broadly, the combination of COVID and the military has also weaponized COVID in the sense of basically people who wanted to get vaccines or access to even oxygen basically had to go through military junta appointed officials to get it. So a really good example, but just, people losing jobs, malnutrition, lack of access to credit for farmers. The suffering is already incredible, and as Lynn said, likely to get worse. People in suffered a lot before. They're resilient and can tolerate probably a lot more than we can, but still, it is important to keep in mind that suffering, and migration either internally or people seeking to head to other countries. It's likely to get worse, sadly.
All right. Now, because we have a good audience here today and very inquisitive questions, we might as well jump right into this. Joe has a question. Sorry, I do not see your last name on the thing, but he asks, has China stopped supporting any faction in Myanmar, including the military? So this is very, very important to kind of understand the role of China in all of this. What is the prominent role of China? Thanks, Joe, for that great question.
Maybe I'll start and then Lynn will add if that's okay. So China, I mean, it sees obviously Myanmar as a neighbor. So it sees Myanmar sort of within its influence. As I mentioned earlier, some of it has major Belt and Road Initiative projects that would lead it to have infrastructure development down through Myanmar into the Indian Ocean, which is really important for it. But I think under the military government earlier, and then under the Aung San Suu Kyi government, China sought to build good relations, to have a lot of influence, to provide a lot of assistance and a lot of loans and projects. It actually had pretty good relations with the Aung San Suu Kyi government. My own personal view, obviously I can't speak for the Chinese government, is that the Chinese probably weren't thrilled with this coup because it brought instability and it brought into power the military, which has tended to be more wary of China than the elected government was, although there's a fair amount of wariness all around. So China, I think, in my view, has kind of tried to have it both ways. They've been engaging the junta, supporting them to some extent, blocking action against them in the UN and elsewhere. But at the same time, they've been sending signals that they're pretty concerned about what's happening and reportedly have urged the military not to sideline Aung San Suu Kyi completely or outlaw her party, which apparently infuriated the military. So I think the Chinese are, they're not happy with the current situation, particularly the instability. But as I said, trying to have it both ways right now.
I would just add that in the geopolitical chess game that is Myanmar, another country to consider is Russia. Big trip made by the general after the coup to Russia, presumably to strengthen military and economic relationships. The Russians are interested in investing in some of the state-owned enterprises that Myanmar has for sale. I think the Russians are also interested in selling arms to the country. So there's another dimension to this regional chess game that's being played out.
Oh yeah, big power struggle with the local, obviously regional powers. There's a lot of good questions. Someone kind of addressed, about the currency, about whether Myanmar might break up. Jim Redcliffe has a really good question, and this has to do with, not just global politics, but human rights generally speaking. I think he asked a question early in the discussion. The drug trade, meth was mentioned as, I did not know that, by the way. That's very interesting. And to what extent is other trafficking happening, human trafficking, exotic animals, etc. And then someone else, and this is kind of linked to this one, talked about the informal labor market. Because the economy is doing so poorly, do you think, this is kind of my add-on, that people are being pushed into this more illegal trade stuff, since that's a way to survive, because it's actually going to increase, I would say, a lot of illegal trade?
Lynn, I have a few thoughts, but maybe you want to take the lead on this?
Well, I'll jump in and just say that different groups in Myanmar have been engaged in different kinds of illegal activity for decades, whether that's the illegal sale of timber, the smuggling of gems, the production of illegal drugs, which, by the way, is not just taking place in Myanmar, but in the entire triangle of countries, including Laos, including Thailand. And it's not clear to what extent these different groups gain from this. Clearly, the ethnic armed organizations mentioned by Scott earlier have a role in this. Other warlords do as well, and most likely the military itself, because they supervise or oversee many of these sectors. Most likely there are connections there as well. In terms of illegal trafficking of people, desperate people find themselves engaged with desperate times. There was a book written by the Associated Press, including a Myanmar journalist, about fishermen's slaves and the extent to which men leaving Myanmar in search of work, thinking they were finding work in the seafood industry, primarily Thai-run at the time, were finding themselves enslaved as employees without a way out on fishing boats throughout the region. Just these are examples of the kinds of stresses that happen in a labor market when local employment is so scarce.
I would only add that, as Lynn said, that the issue of illicit smuggling trade, whether of drugs, of products, sadly of people and wild animals, has been there for a long time. You have a lot of poor areas in particularly along the borderlands where people don't have a lot of opportunities. You have the long story of women being basically sold as child brides into China, particularly from the Northeast. This has been going on for some time. There have been some efforts to control it, but with minimal success. And then the coup just makes everything worse because it makes that many more people vulnerable and therefore, maybe more desperate and willing to take risks that could put them in jeopardy.
Not the most optimistic conclusion, and this is a conundrum. That sooner or later something has to happen. But Richard Fincher has a very unique experience. He says as a USAID contractor to Myanmar, he's saying that there's been a debate in the garment unions, European Union or the European brands, on whether they should stop orders from Myanmar. Should there be, say, not just sanctions from countries, I would even expand that question, but by different garment industries, because I was in somewhere and I noticed, which I did not know, and you can, Lynn, obviously expand on this, that some of the garments there was said made in Burma, Myanmar. Is there a movement to essentially start blocking some of their exports? And will this have any kind of effect, or will it just hurt, like a lot of times sanctions and these movements often hurt not the military, but whatever dictatorship is in power, but the regular people themselves?
So that's a big question. Let me tackle a few different dimensions of it. Sanctions have not been general imposed against Burma. Rather, they're selective against institutions, businesses, and individuals associated with the military. So the US government, the European Union, and other countries have been very careful about the kinds of activities they've sanctioned. But in fact, in this whole discussion around certain companies deciding to pull out and other companies deciding to stay, there has indeed, as Richard is well aware, and as he mentions, there has been a lively debate about what does responsible investment mean under such hard and straining conditions. The trade unions, not necessarily the membership, but the leaders of the trade unions, both within Myanmar and internationally, are indeed pushing for buyers to stop sourcing from Myanmar. That's not a sanctions issue, but that's a company strategy decision. And yet international human rights groups have argued that the garment industry, for example, expanded its employment roles to hundreds of thousands of people over the last 10 years. And people are then left with even fewer livelihood opportunities, income earning opportunities, if companies pull out. So you have companies such as H&M, a big Swedish apparel brand, and other brands and retailers as well, who've done their due diligence, who've hired auditing companies to figure out whether the factories from which they source are directly linked to sanctioned individuals. And if they're not, the feeling on the part of those companies is it's better to continue to buy and at least give some people within the country an opportunity to earn a living.
If I could just add that this is, certainly goes far beyond what foreign companies and foreign countries do. Within Myanmar, there is a really difficult kind of constant debate going on. We have friends who have small businesses in Myanmar who are opposed to the coup, but have tried to keep their businesses open because for their own livelihoods, but also they, loyal to their employees and want to keep people employed. And they've come under a lot of pressure that, to join this civil disobedience movement. And the argument of some in the civil disobedience movement is, we have to really take this economy down as the only way of forcing the military out. Of course, the consequences of that are tragic. And it's just my personal view. I think Myanmar people can have that debate and make those decisions. I think it's really hard as a foreigner to say, what's morally right here. And so while I respect the decisions of Myanmar people to either say you shouldn't do business or you should, I think as a foreigner, saying we're going to help you destroy the economy to get the military out is tough. So it's just a classic no-win situation.
Right. And some countries can use that to their benefit. See, we're being attacked abroad, imperialism, etc. I've got a couple questions here, Ian and another Luke, asking more about if you could go into deeper about the outside powers. Luke talks about the role of Japan, whereas Ian is saying, could you kind of expand on ASEAN's ability to pressure Myanmar? What needs to happen to have to basically push ASEAN to play a stronger role here? What might incentivize ASEAN and disincentivize it?
Sure. I think on Japan has historically a very good relationship with Myanmar, both with the civilian elected government before, and to a certain extent with the military. They've taken a pretty strong stance, certainly by Japanese standards, against the coup, have cut their official assistance. I don't know if they've cut it completely to the military, but they've cut it, to the government, but they've cut it significantly. And as a result have strained their relationship with the military. For ASEAN, the reality is ASEAN doesn't really have the ability to force the military out, but I think ASEAN saying, you guys are suspended or you can't participate in summits and so on would be a blow, because part of the battle going on right now is for legitimacy. And, if you invite in and do business with the military junta, it gives them a boost. If, on the other hand, you engage with the national unity government, it gives them a boost. And I think ASEAN could do more on that front. That's really the threat that ASEAN has is, hey, we're just going to have to engage with the national unity government military because you guys are hopeless. It's very hard for ASEAN to do that. It would be absolutely unprecedented. But it's possible that some members of ASEAN might be doing that more and more. And that's, and then you could cut back on, you could impose sanctions, although again, that's not ASEAN's history and tradition of doing that. So I think that's pretty unlikely. So my hope is that they say to the military, if you don't start to play ball and make some concessions and lighten up and engage talks, there's going to be consequences for you. And I think the generals would not want to see themselves losing standing within ASEAN. I don't know that it would completely change their minds, but it is a pressure point to some extent.
I would just mention that another forum where the issue of recognition recently raised its head and then disappeared again for a while is at the United Nations General Assembly last month. As some of you may recall, the former government's ambassador to the United Nations made a very forceful public statement against the coup several months ago. And in September, the issue arose as to which governments, either the coup State Administration Council's ambassador or the ambassador representing the National Unity Government, which of those ambassadors would be recognized at the United Nations. And there was a slight game being played amongst senior members or larger country members of the United Nations with the decision to put off the credentialing decision until later this year. And so it's, I suppose, anyone's guess as to how they will decide, but that will be another marker point when the international community will be forced to declare who is allowed to represent Myanmar and its people at the UN.
Wow. Now, this has been a lamentable subject to the extent to which I'll be drinking a lot of red wine tonight. But is there anything positive on the horizon? Anything positive? I understand it's very difficult. I mean, the terror, the genocide, etc. But anything positive we could end with here? You know, the nobility of suffering, these people getting up every day, working hard, trying to build their country, etc. We understand, but anything more on the positive side on this?
Yeah, I think so, but a little bit longer term, with a little bit longer term outlook. I think, as Lynn referred to earlier, with the coup and the fact that the military is now brutalizing the ethnic Bamar population the same as it has the ethnic minorities for decades, there's seems to be much greater sympathy and recognition among the ethnic Bamar, particularly among the younger generation. That, wow, you know, we should have been more sympathetic, whether it's toward ethnic minorities as a whole or even toward the Rohingya, who previously almost nobody was sympathetic to. So you have, I'd say, a nascent sort of public discussion going on about, hey, how can we work together? And related to that is, I think, and my own personal view is, this is a country where the younger generation tends to think, at least those who are politically active, tends to think quite differently and much more progressively, I would say, than the older generation. And you may be seeing the beginnings of some generational change here, which I think would be very helpful. So I think at great cost, the coup has sort of accelerated the process of dialogue, discussion, and about what kind of country Myanmar should be. That is much needed. Still a long way to go, but I'd say that's the silver lining or the hopeful aspect of this.
100%, I agree.
That seems to be one of the cases we talked about before, is the fact that, you know, people, you know, go on with their daily lives and kind of ignore often, and not because, you know, we have the tendency to dismiss it because we have things going on in our daily lives, the fact that maybe other groups are being attacked. Now with the coup, it seems like they're probably thinking, wow, we should have taken this more seriously earlier, because now I'm actually being attacked and the economy is being ruined, etc. I really hope the future of Myanmar gets brighter. It's a very lamentable but very important and powerful subject that we've been tackling in all of my classes. Is there any other kind of conflict resolution you think might be necessary? I know you can't, like, say direct intervention or something like that, but the role of the United Nations, the role of the United States, is there anything possible to get to kind of, let's just say, expedite the conflict resolution strategies to address this conflict?
I would say at this point, it's hard to see in terms of conflict resolution between the military and all the forces opposed to them. I think you know, it's important for the United States and others to stay engaged and be talking, so that if and when things change on the ground, we're there and prepared to play a helpful role. But I think secondly, there is a lot that the United States and others can do, and I think are doing to some extent, to encourage, support this broader dialogue that's beginning. And that means, you know, continuing scholarship programs, other things that would bring people together from the different communities in Myanmar to talk about what kind of future they build. I think there's a fair amount that we can do in that, more as a, creating a space for people to continue that discussion that's really needed.
And I think this conference is incredibly important because it opens up that space to understand more about what few people, including myself, and I'm a professor in School of Politics and Global Study, really knew about Myanmar, because Myanmar was never at the forefront of analysis. And I think you two are doing an amazing job at bringing it to the forefront of analysis, so it gets the attention, it attracts that attention it deserves. I'm sorry, Lynn, did you want to say anything?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
All right, I want to thank everyone for coming out. It seems like we have 2 minutes left. If Tina or Ian want to say anything as closing ideas, or anyone else, please.
This has been fantastic. I want to thank our speakers, both of you, for taking the time and not only sharing your time, but your wisdom and experience at this critical moment. It's fantastic that so many people were able to join. Thank you, Charles, for moderating, and thank you everyone for joining. Fantastic. Thank you.
I learned so much. I mean, thank you to you both, and Ian for being here. I mean, this was definitely enlightening and is going to help me in my professional career as well, dealing with this in global politics, political violence, and all of the courses I teach.
Thank you everyone for joining, and hopefully we'll see you at future events coming up soon. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks for having us. Cheers.